Yeshena, V'libier, Kol Dodi Dofek Pitchili. Ani Yeshena, V'libier, Kol Dodi Dofek Pitchili. Ani Yeshena, V'libier, Kol Dodi Dofek Pitchili. Ani Yeshena, V'libier, Kol Dodi Dofek Pitchili. Achoti Rayati, Yonati Tamati, Sheroshi, Nimlata, Kvutzotai, Resiselayla. Achoti Rayati, Yonati Tamati, Sheroshi, Nimlata, Kvutzotai, Resiselayla. Ani Yeshena, V'libier, Kol Dodi Dofek Pitchili. Ani Yeshena, V'libier, Kol Dodi Dofek Pitchili. Achoti Rayati, Yonati Tamati, Sheroshi, Nimlata, Kvutzotai, Resiselayla. Achoti Rayati, Yonati Tamati, Sheroshi, Nimlata, Kvutzotai, Resiselayla. Ani Yeshena, V'libier, Kol Dodi Dofek Pitchili. Ani Yeshena, V'libier, Kol Dodi Dofek Pitchili. Achoti Rayati, Yonati Tamati, Sheroshi, Nimlata, Kvutzotai, Resiselayla. Achoti Rayati, Yonati Tamati, Sheroshi, Nimlata, Kvutzotai, Resiselayla. Ani Yeshena, V'libier, Kol Dodi Dofek Pitchili. Ani Yeshena, V'libier, Kol Dodi Dofek Pitchili. Let's do it all one more time. Achoti Rayati, Yonati Tamati, Sheroshi, Nimlata, Kvutzotai, Resiselayla. Achoti Rayati, Yonati Tamati, Sheroshi, Nimlata, Kvutzotai, Resiselayla. bier, kol dori dofek pitrili. Ani yeshena, the kol dori dofek pitrili. Good evening, friends. I really do love seeing you sing along with this. Thank you. Even though Zoom is not conducive to hearing each other's voices. So, with our metaphors for this week that we're exploring is in some ways kind of the most diffuse metaphor of the metaphors. So for those of you who read the book, you may have noticed that when Rabbi Spitzer writes about Kol, the divine voice, she writes about sound, she writes about silence, she writes about the messages that we receive that we might experience as voice, and she writes about our crying out. So it's a lot. It's one meta. She's having one concept do a lot of work. And before I ask any of you a question, I want to tell 3 very brief stories that in the hopes that they will open something about this metaphor for each of you. And if they do, feel free to respond in the chat as they do. They are all true stories from my own life. One is the story of one of the first times I ever fell in love, not with the person to whom I'm currently partnered ideally for life. But I was 16 years old. I was at the Havurah Institute, which is a summer week-long gathering on the East Coast for people affiliated with Havurot and other unconventional Jewish communities. And I was in a late night song circle. We were chanting Hebrew chants, possibly including the one I was just chanting. I don't think that one, but things like that. And songs from Rise Up Singing. Anybody know Rise Up Singing, the folk song singing songbook? Yeah, grew up with that. And we were just in one of those like spiritually high places where we were all making really good music together and singing together. And I looked up and I caught the eye of someone sitting across the circle. And I was like, oh, yeah. Totally fell in love with that person. Took me probably 2 years to get over it, even though the bulk of our encounter was that week. And really the most important part of our encounter was that song circle. So that's like one experience of divine Kol. Totally different experience of divine Kol. I was, a few years ago, I was invited to participate in a training, mostly rabbinical students and Jewish educators, called Torah Trek Guides Training. And it was a training led by Rabbi Mike Comins, who's the author of A Wild Faith and also the author of the book Making Prayer Real, which I've given as a gift to some of you. And this training was a couple of years long, and the first time we all gathered as a community, we did a 1-day wilderness solo each. And the second time we gathered, we did an overnight wilderness solo. And the third time we gathered, we did a 4 full-day wilderness solo. And while we were on our 4 full-day wilderness solo, the protocol was that we had dispersed on this mountain ridge, and we were each far enough from the other participants that we would be guaranteed to not interact with each other by accident, but close enough that we could, each have a buddy that we would go and like tie a knot in a rope once a day and check that our buddy had tied a knot in a rope and know that they're okay. And if we didn't see their knot in the rope, we'd go to their spot and find them. That's the backstory. And then we were supposed to be staying in our own assigned area and doing our own spiritual practice. And at one point, probably the second day, I was doing one of the practices that's mentioned in this chapter called Hitbodedut, where I was spontaneously talking to God. And I got really angry. I don't remember what I got angry about, but I started yelling, "Answer me," and like screaming louder and louder, "Answer me, answer me." When the echo died down, I heard Owen, my buddy, who's like, somewhere in his solo spot, 300 yards away, but like hidden by woods or whatever on the other side of the ridge, yell, Ruhi, are you okay? I was like, yes, damn it, I'm talking to God, not you. And it wasn't until a couple days later, after journaling about it, that I was like, what did I expect as a response, if not that? Of course, I got an answer. Okay. Story number 3, the time that I fell in love with the person that I am currently partnered to. I fell in love with Jacob by arguing with him. We met in Jerusalem. I mean, the very specific moment that I started to fall in love with him, looking back, we met in Jerusalem. We were housemates in a large co-op home, and we had agreed that we would co-organize a second-day Rosh Hashanah picnic for a bunch of rabbinical students and pluralistic yeshiva students. And without going into too much detail, towards the end of the picnic, he came up to me and said, I'm going to organize the blessing after meeting, and I'm Orthodox affiliated, so I'm going to do it in a non-egalitarian Orthodox way. Is that okay with you? And I was like, you do you. And he did it, and then I got really mad at him, and I was like, hey, if you can do you and you can be Orthodox, but like I'm not, and don't ask me to give you permission to be Orthodox and to give you the imprimatur to do something non-egalitarian. Like, you do you, but like don't ask me to be okay with it. Actually, I'm not. And he shocked me by not getting defensive. He was like, oh, I never thought about how that would bother you. Tell me more. And then I like took out more irritation on him, and he just like kept hearing it and asking more questions. And throughout our getting to know each other would just be like, very unapologetically, I am Orthodox and I have my needs. And also I'm like really curious about what your needs are and how we can meet them in this community that we're trying to be in together. And it was so irritating. It was so defiant of my stereotypes of what a guy who wants to be an Orthodox rabbi was supposed to be. And over our discussions and our arguments about this, I wound up realizing that I was falling in love with him. So I wanted to share those 3 stories about divine voice with you this evening, in the hopes that they would speak to you, as I hoped they might, about the various ways that we might often unexpectedly encounter holiness, divinity, spiritual connection through the experience of voice. And so with that setup, I'll invite you to share. Actually, before I invite you to share, because I think it's a lot of pressure in the chat, I'll invite you to reflect, and you can journal yourselves for a few minutes or just think about it, whether triggered by my stories or not, or the reading or any other thinking this week. How have you ever felt a spiritual connection through either raising your own voice or hearing another voice call to you or reach out to you? How have you ever felt a spiritual connection either through raising your own voice or receiving being receptive to the call of another voice. I really appreciate the person who just wrote that he's blanking and feels terrible about it. I find it really interesting that the person who wrote that I know is a person whose career is literally includes leading sacred music. And thank you for sharing that. I bet you're not the only one feeling that way, and I bet there are others in your boat who are also feeling inadequate because you don't have a holy voice experience. And I'll just remind us all at this point that we're doing this because it's new to us, because we don't necessarily have a lot of practice thinking about the sacred in these ways. I'm enjoying. Things are coming in the chat. I got a few requests since the last class that I not actually read everything in the chat out loud. So I will comment only on the ones that trigger a response from me, but I'm appreciating that there is content coming in. I noticed just some trends. People are commenting on experiences of synchronous song or audiencing together. And there are also several comments about interactions with babies and children, those whose voices are completely unself-conscious. And a few people commenting on the sort of voices that really come from outside our own experience or our own expectation. Walking down the street years back in Eugene and heard some kind of voice in my head saying, "Go to synagogue." Love that. During the silence at a friend's meeting, or right after or during musical performances. Beautiful. So just observing, just from the comments coming in the chat, and people should feel free to continue sharing if you would like. We find sacred experience through voices that, may not be the voices of people articulating words that are, clear messages. We find sacred experiences from voices that are the voices of people articulating not words, articulating crying or laughter. We find sacred experience in silence. We find sacred experience in responding to the call of someone who needs something from us. I love that someone brought up water. Again, I feel like water has continued to be a theme from the very first session. And in fact, in the first session, we chanted Mikolot Mayim Rabim, from above the sounds of the many waters. So water certainly has a voice. And we sometimes hear inner voices that guide us. We sometimes have communication with each other, between ourselves and others without words, or between ourselves and others that prompts us to find the right words with each other. And we sometimes receive internal guidance from something else. Which reminds me of one more very brief story. When I was a first-year rabbinical student, which is a great time to have theological crisis. Pretty much every rabbinical student has some sort of theological crisis in their first year. And I was in a spiritual direction chavruta. So I was a spiritual direction partner sharing. We had a spiritual director, and they would assign us to a partner, and we would meet together. And my partner in this group was a fifth-year student. So at one point, when I was sort of talking about all my spinning about, like, do I believe, don't I believe, said, well, I don't believe in a personal God, but it's too bad because I still have one. And just that voice from someone else reminding me it's okay. It's a reality that we sometimes experience things that we may struggle to believe in. Okay. So there's still beautiful insights coming in, and thank you all for sharing. I also want to give you time to discuss sacred voice. And I mentioned this in the most recent email I sent to the class, but just as a clarification, because some comments came in since the last class, it is okay and expected that you will spend some of this time in small groups reading the sources that I sent out, whether out loud or just taking a few moments to yourselves, because it was not expected that everyone would have done the reading in advance. And hopefully by giving you more time, I'll give you about 20 minutes this evening, you'll feel like you have time to get through the readings and discuss the discussion questions. And if that format, I hope that format is good tonight. And if that format does not feel good, I hope and I'm sure you'll give me feedback. Okay. Just a moment, and I will find the sharing link for those who would like it for the Holy Voice text. And then I will send you into breakout rooms. So the link is in the chat. And I'm just sending you all off. All right, my dears, welcome back. Apologies as always to those who were mid-sentence when you got unceremoniously booted back to this space. And I'll ask the question that I ask in every class, which is, okay, so what does this metaphor do for us? When does it work for us? In what context, and what are its benefits? The voice works best when I set aside my expectations of what it should sound like. If you have examples, please don't hold back. It's only holding back to give others space if you've been taking up a lot of space. But the beauty of the chat is there's infinite space in the chat. At the request of many, I'm not going to unmute people in this space, but we will have space to unmute after we officially close the class. I wonder if part of the struggle that we're having in this moment, because there is a lot less coming in very quickly than we've had in past classes, is that it's definitely something that, you know, unlike place where you can sort of in an active will say, I'm gonna find the sacred in this place, I'm gonna set an intention of looking for the sacred in this place, or, you know, water, which we encounter all the time and can sort of, again, set an intention of seeing as holy. Voice, we can't necessarily conjure a voice, a sacred voice by an act of will. We can't sit here and be like, oh, what's the voice saying to me right now? And guarantee that a voice will say anything in a given moment. Someone writes, that's what makes it cool. In some ways, this is a metaphor that's less domesticatable than some of the others that we've studied. So we're starting to see the comments about finding the voice in a silence, in a meditative kind of space, where we receive messages, but also finding the voice in outrage, in shared outrage together. crying out in Me Too, or in a rally, or from slavery in Egypt. And some people point out that my framing of it is not accurate, that in fact the voice is always there calling to us. And we're just not as good at hearing in the silence as we might be as finding God in water, or finding God in visual experiences. We are a very visual species. So I suspect we've already started to answer this question, which I appreciate. But what's hard? What's challenging about this metaphor? What makes it hard to access it? Besides our propensity to focus on the visual. I like someone pointing out that it doesn't really work when other people are telling you what the voice is saying. You kind of got to hear it for yourself. There is this fine line between a voice that is divine insight and a voice that the world will define as pathological. And sometimes, certainly, if we look at like the prophets in Torah, it's the same thing. So to the person who says it feels unnatural, and to the person who says they have questions about Rabbi Spitzer's choice of text, I would ask you to share a little more about those questions and resistances, respectively. So I see, I mean, sort of a big theme coming up is this is hard. We're not great at silence. And we're not practiced at this. And it's really hard to tell the difference between the noise and the divine voice that's coming through. So I want us to take a few moments and just consider some practices that may or may not help you access the divine voice in practice. And probably most, if not all of them, you'll look at them and be like, "Ooh, I don't want to do that." That feels hard. That feels unnatural. I can also send out this document after class. But the book describes this a little bit, and here's a description of how I do this. Hit bodedut, literally aloning oneself, is a practice developed by Rabbi Nachman of Breslov, who often struggled to connect to the divine voice, of spending some time. He said, go out to the forest. He said for an hour. I don't recommend starting with the intent of an hour, and just speaking out loud, directing your own voice to God and crying out whatever truth you need to say, not making up stuff. So if you start by saying, this feels really silly and I don't even know if I believe anything's listening, just see where that takes you. See where that talking takes you. And with all of these practices, as you can see, Hitbodedut, chanting, meditation, which I've put no description of because I'm so bad at it. So you'll have to go to someone who actually likes silent meditation to get a compelling description of how to do it well. Or a walk in the woods, you may note that it is important in each of these to have time for silence. We're going to ask a question, we have to make the space to hear the answer. So in a few minutes, I'm going to sing our song again to close this session, and then give us some time unmuted, anyone who wants to talk about some of the meta stuff coming up, as I wrote in my email last week. But first, I'm going to ask a favor of all of you to take a few minutes and at least start filling out this midway survey about how the class is going. There's a few multiple choice questions. I just put it in the chat. It's a live link. You can click on it. And a few, little bit more asking for your process questions. Before you get deep in there, please note, we do not have class next week. This time next week, I will, God willing, be on an airplane returning from a conference on the East Coast. So our next scheduled class is 2 weeks from tonight, which is the night before Thanksgiving. And one of the questions in the survey evaluation is, does that night work? Or should we look at rescheduling and or shortening the class? So I'll stop talking and stop recording for a moment and give you all a few minutes to fill out the survey before we officially close the class recording. We will close with a repetition of the Ani Yeshena chant, which I'll screen share in a moment, and then those who would like can stay and be unmuted and talk more organically about the things that have come up, while those who would like to go to bed can disappear and go to bed, and we wish you good night. Thank you for taking this time together this evening. Ani Yeshena v'libier kol dodi dofek pitchili. Ani Yeshena v'libier kol dodi dofek pitchili. Achoti rayati yonati tamati sheroshi nimlatal kutsotai resiselaila. Achoti rayati yonati tamati sheroshi nimlatal kutsotai resiselaila. Ani Yeshena v'libier kol dodi dofek